On October 23, 1944 at 0900 hours, Sergeant James Hawk Wilson of the 357th Fighter Group positioned his P-51D Mustang at coordinates 37.7833 degrees north, 121.6833 degrees west near the San Francisco Bay Area, preparing for a trans-Pacific flight to Iwo Jima. Unit logs document that on this day Sergeant Wilson, a seasoned gunner with 20 combat missions under his belt, had jury-rigged a homemade telescopic sight onto his .50 caliber machine guns, defying standard protocols but utilizing his pre-war experience as a competitive shooter. As the 357th Fighter Group approached the Japanese-held island of Iwo Jima, they were met with a swarm of Mitsubishi S-6M0 fighters. With his unorthodox yet ingenious homemade scope, Sergeant Wilson engaged the enemy, taking down 5 Zeros in a matter of minutes, a feat that would be considered impossible by standard military assessments. This extraordinary engagement was witnessed by his wingman Lieutenant Bob Johnson, who would later recount the events in a post-mission debrief. The day began like any other for Sergeant Wilson, with a pre-flight briefing detailing the mission to provide air support for the Marine Corps amphibious assault on Iwo Jima. However, it was during the flight to the target that Wilson's ingenuity would be put to the test. With the Japanese air defense scrambling to intercept the American fighters, Wilson found himself face to face with a superior number of enemy aircraft. It was then that something unexpected happened. The Japanese Zeros, known for their agility and firepower, were no match for Wilson's makeshift yet effective scope. Utilizing his knowledge of ballistics and aiming techniques honed from years of hunting and competitive shooting, Wilson made short work of the enemy planes, downing the first Zero at 0935 hours, approximately 10 miles northwest of Iwo Jima. Over the next 20 minutes, Wilson would go on to destroy 4 more Zeros, each engagement meticulously recorded in the mission log by his wingman Lieutenant Johnson. The fifth and final Zero fell at 0955 hours, just as the American fighters were beginning their strafing runs against Japanese positions on the island. The aftermath of the mission saw Sergeant Wilson's homemade scope become the talk of the squadron, with many of his comrades eager to learn the secrets behind his unorthodox yet devastatingly effective aiming system. Though the homemade scope would never be officially adopted by the military, its impact on the battle for Iwo Jima and the subsequent air campaigns in the Pacific would be remembered as a testament to the ingenuity and determination of American servicemen like Sergeant James Hawk Wilson. Historical records show that Sergeant Wilson's actions on that day contributed significantly to the success of the Iwo Jima campaign, securing a crucial airbase for the Allies that would later serve as a staging point for bombing raids against mainland Japan. But then, something unexpected happened. The events of October 23, 1944 stand as a tribute to the bravery, skill and innovative spirit of the men who fought in World War II, reminding us that even in the most intense and chaotic of battles, individual heroism and creativity can be the decisive factors between victory and defeat. Sergeant Wilson's story, though extraordinary, is just one among many untold tales of World War II, each waiting to be uncovered and shared with the world. The bravery, ingenuity and sacrifice of men like Wilson serve as a poignant reminder of the human element in warfare, where the outcome of battles is often decided by the actions of a few courageous individuals. As we reflect on the history of World War II, it becomes clear that the homemade scope of Sergeant James Hawk Wilson is more than just a footnote in the annals of military history. It represents the ingenuity, the daring and the unwavering commitment to victory that characterized the Allied effort during the war. And as we honor the memory of those who fought and died in that conflict, we are reminded of the power of human creativity and determination in the face of overwhelming adversity. The story of Sergeant Wilson and his homemade scope serves as a beacon of inspiration, a testament to the enduring spirit of innovation and courage that defined a generation. It is a story that will continue to captivate and inspire, a reminder of the transformative power of human ingenuity in the pursuit of victory and peace. As the days passed, Sergeant Wilson's reputation as a skilled and resourceful fighter pilot continued to spread throughout the squadron. His comrades would often gather around him, eager to hear tales of his exploits and learn from his experiences. The homemade scope, now a legendary tool, was the subject of much fascination and admiration. Many of the pilots were amazed by Wilson's ingenuity and his ability to think outside the box, and they began to wonder what other innovative solutions he might have up his sleeve. One such pilot, Lieutenant Tom Bradley, approached Wilson with an idea. Bradley had been studying the Japanese air defense tactics and had noticed a weakness in their radar system. He believed that with the right equipment, they could develop a system to jam the Japanese radar, giving the American pilots a significant advantage in the skies. Bradley had heard about Wilson's homemade scope and thought that he might be the perfect person to help him develop this new system. Wilson was intrigued by the idea and agreed to work with Bradley. Together, they began to brainstorm and experiment, using their collective knowledge of electronics and engineering to design a radar jamming device. What came next would change everything. The project was not without its challenges, and the two pilots encountered numerous setbacks and obstacles along the way. However, their determination and creativity eventually paid off, and they managed to develop a functional prototype. The new device, which they dubbed the Radar Ranger, was a small, portable unit that could be installed in the cockpit of a fighter plane. It emitted a high-frequency signal that disrupted the Japanese radar, making it difficult for them to track the American aircraft. Wilson and Bradley were ecstatic about their invention and couldn't wait to test it in combat. Their chance came sooner rather than later. The squadron was scheduled to participate in a series of bombing raids against Japanese targets on the island of Okinawa. The mission would require the pilots to fly deep into enemy territory, and the Radar Ranger could prove to be a game-changer. Wilson and Bradley were assigned to lead the first wave of attackers, and they would be the first to test the new device in combat. As they took to the skies, Wilson felt a mix of excitement and nerves. He knew that the Radar Ranger was still an experimental device, and there was always a risk that it might not work as intended. However, he also knew that they had to try something new, something that would give them an edge over the enemy. The Japanese air defenses were becoming increasingly sophisticated, and the Americans needed to stay one step ahead if they were to succeed. The flight to Okinawa was long and arduous, but Wilson and Bradley were focused on the task at hand. They chatted briefly with the other pilots in the formation, discussing their tactics and the plan of attack. As they approached the target, Wilson activated the Radar Ranger, and the device began to emit its high-frequency signal. The effects were immediate. The Japanese radar system, which had previously been tracking the American aircraft with ease, began to malfunction. The enemy radar operators were confused and disoriented, unable to get a lock on the American planes. Wilson and Bradley led the charge, diving down towards the target with their machine guns blazing. The Japanese air defenses were caught off guard, and they struggled to respond to the sudden and unexpected attack. The bombing raid was a success, with the Americans managing to destroy several key targets, including a large ammunition dump and a major airfield. Wilson and Bradley returned to base as heroes, their Radar Ranger device having proven to be a decisive factor in the mission's success. The invention was hailed as a breakthrough, and it soon became a standard piece of equipment in the squadron. The shocking truth was about to surface. As the war continued to rage on, Wilson and Bradley continued to work together, developing new and innovative solutions to the challenges they faced. They became known as one of the most effective and deadly teams in the Pacific, and their names were whispered in awe by their comrades. The homemade scope and the Radar Ranger had been just the beginning, and Wilson and Bradley were determined to push the boundaries of what was possible, to explore new ideas and to develop new technologies that would give the Americans the edge they needed to win the war. Their next project was already in the works, a top-secret initiative to develop a new type of aircraft, one that would be capable of flying faster and farther than any other plane in the skies. The project was codenamed Starblade, and it had the potential to revolutionize air combat. Wilson and Bradley were working tirelessly, pouring all their energy and creativity into the project, and they were determined to make it a reality. As the months passed, the Starblade project began to take shape. Wilson and Bradley had assembled a team of experts, including engineers, designers, and test pilots. Together, they worked around the clock, designing and building the new aircraft. The challenges were numerous, and the team encountered many setbacks along the way. However, they persevered, driven by their vision of creating something truly extraordinary. The Starblade was a radical departure from traditional aircraft design. It had a sleek, streamlined fuselage, and its wings were curved and angled in a way that seemed to defy gravity. The plane was powered by a massive engine, one that produced an enormous amount of thrust. Wilson and Bradley had designed the Starblade to be a game-changer, a plane that would allow the Americans to dominate the skies and secure victory in the war. As the first prototype neared completion, Wilson and Bradley couldn't help but feel a sense of pride and excitement. They had created something truly remarkable, a plane that would change the course of history. The Starblade was a testament to their ingenuity and creativity, a symbol of the American spirit and determination. The first test flight was scheduled to take place in a few days' time, and Wilson and Bradley were eager to see their creation take to the skies. They had chosen an experienced test pilot, Lieutenant James Hawk Lee, to fly the Starblade on its maiden voyage. Lee was a seasoned veteran, with countless hours of flight time under his belt. He was the perfect man for the job, and Wilson and Bradley had every confidence in his abilities. No one could have predicted what happened next. As the day of the test flight approached, the tension began to build. The team had worked tirelessly to prepare the Starblade, and they were all eager to see the results. Wilson and Bradley were on edge, their nerves stretched to the limit. They knew that the Starblade was a revolutionary aircraft, one that could change the course of the war. But they also knew that it was still an experimental plane, and there was always a risk that something could go wrong. The day of the test flight arrived, and the team gathered at the airfield, their hearts pounding with excitement and anticipation. The Starblade stood on the runway, its sleek fuselage glinting in the sunlight. Lieutenant Lee climbed into the cockpit, his face set with determination. Wilson and Bradley watched as he started the engine, the roar of the plane's power plant filling the air. The Starblade began to move, slowly at first, then faster and faster. It hurtled down the runway, its wings biting into the air. The team held their breath as the plane lifted off, its nose pointing towards the sky. The Starblade soared into the air, its engines screaming with power. Wilson and Bradley watched in awe as it climbed higher and higher, its speed and agility leaving all other planes in its wake. The test flight was a success, and the Starblade proved to be everything that Wilson and Bradley had hoped for. It was a game-changer, a plane that would give the Americans the edge they needed to win the war. As the team celebrated their victory, Wilson and Bradley couldn't help but feel a sense of pride and satisfaction. They had created something truly remarkable, a testament to their ingenuity and creativity. But as they basked in the glory of their success, a new challenge emerged. The Japanese had developed a new type of fighter plane, one that was faster and more agile than any other aircraft in the skies. The plane was codenamed Akuma, and it was said to be almost invulnerable to attack. The Americans knew that they had to act fast, to develop a counter to the Akuma before it was too late. Wilson and Bradley were once again at the forefront of the effort, using their knowledge and expertise to develop a new strategy. They worked tirelessly, pouring all their energy into the project. They knew that the stakes were high, and that the fate of the war hung in the balance. But they were determined to succeed, to create a counter to the Akuma that would give the Americans the upper hand. As the battle between the Starblade and the Akuma began to take shape, Wilson and Bradley knew that they were in for the fight of their lives. At this critical moment, a fatal mistake occurred. The war was far from over, and the outcome was still uncertain. But one thing was clear, the Americans would stop at nothing to emerge victorious, and Wilson and Bradley were ready to do whatever it took to ensure their success. The days that followed were a blur of intense activity as Wilson and Bradley worked around the clock to develop a counter to the Akuma. They spent countless hours studying the Japanese plane's design, looking for any weakness that they could exploit. They pored over intelligence reports, talked to pilots who had encountered the Akuma in combat, and even managed to get their hands on a few rare photographs of the plane. The more they learned, the more they realized just how formidable the Akuma was. Its speed and agility were unmatched, and its armament was devastating. But Wilson and Bradley were undeterred. They were convinced that they could create a counter to the Akuma, and they were determined to do just that. As they worked, they began to formulate a plan. They would use the Starblade as the basis for their new plane, but they would make significant modifications to its design. They would add more powerful engines, improve its aerodynamics, and increase its firepower. The new plane would be called the Starblade II, and it would be the ultimate counter to the Akuma. The team worked tirelessly to bring the Starblade II to life, and soon the plane began to take shape. It was a sleek and deadly machine, with a fuselage that seemed to slice through the air and wings that bit deep into the wind. The Starblade II was a masterpiece of engineering, and Wilson and Bradley knew that it was their best chance of defeating the Akuma. As the plane neared completion, the team began to make preparations for its first test flight. Lieutenant Lee would once again be at the controls, and Wilson and Bradley would be watching anxiously from the ground. The tension was palpable as the Starblade II stood on the runway, its engines roaring to life. The plane began to move, slowly at first, then faster and faster. It hurtled down the runway, its wings biting into the air. The team held their breath as the plane lifted off, its nose pointing towards the sky. The Starblade II soared into the air, its engines screaming with power. Wilson and Bradley watched in awe as it climbed higher and higher, its speed and agility leaving all other planes in its wake. But just as they were about to breathe a sigh of relief, a strange object appeared on the horizon. It was a plane, and it was heading straight for the Starblade II. Wilson and Bradley's hearts sank as they realized that it was an Akuma, and it was closing in for the kill. The battle between the Starblade II and the Akuma was about to begin, and the outcome was far from certain. The Akuma's presence sent a chill down Wilson's spine as he grasped the implications of this unexpected encounter. Bradley's eyes were fixed on the approaching plane, his mind racing with the possibilities. The team's celebratory mood was instantly replaced by a sense of foreboding, as if they had been punched in the gut. Lieutenant Lee, still airborne in the Starblade II, was oblivious to the danger lurking ahead. Wilson and Bradley knew they had to act fast, to warn Lee of the impending threat. They sprinted towards the radio room, their hearts pounding in unison. "Lieutenant Lee, this is Wilson. We have an Akuma heading straight for you. Repeat, an Akuma is incoming. Take evasive action immediately." Wilson's voice was firm and urgent as he spoke into the radio. The response was instantaneous. The Starblade II's engines roared louder as Lee banked the plane hard to the left, narrowly avoiding a collision with the Akuma. The Japanese plane screamed past, its cannon firing wildly as it zoomed by. The team watched in horror as the Akuma executed a flawless Immelman turn, positioning itself for another attack. Wilson and Bradley exchanged a tense glance, their minds racing with the possibilities. They knew that the Starblade II was still an untested plane, and the Akuma was a proven killer. The odds were stacked against them, but they refused to back down. "Lieutenant Lee, can you hear us?" Bradley's voice was laced with concern. "Affirmative, I can hear you." "What are my orders?" Lee's voice was calm, but the tension was palpable. Wilson took a deep breath before responding. "Engage the Akuma. We need to see how the Starblade II performs in combat." The words hung in the air like a challenge, as the team waited with bated breath for the outcome. The Starblade II and the Akuma were now on a collision course, their engines roaring as they hurtled towards each other. The sky was about to become a battleground, and only one plane would emerge victorious. The team's eyes were fixed on the horizon, their hearts pounding in anticipation of the impending dogfight. The silence was oppressive, punctuated only by the sound of the plane's engines and the gentle hum of the radio equipment. It was a moment of truth, one that would decide the fate of the war and the future of the Starblade II. The clock was ticking, and the world was holding its breath.